Hey and welcome to this full-length comprehensive tutorial on texturing in Marmoset Toolbag 4. My name's Hannah and I'm going to be taking you through the processes I've used in texturing this vintage embalming machine diorama. We'll be covering the whole pipeline from baking the output maps in Toolbag 4, right up to presenting the model and grabbing some renders. So if you'd like to learn how to make use of Toolbag's new baking and texturing systems, then stick around and let's dig into it. If you haven't already, I'd recommend watching our Intro to Toolbag 4 series, also narrated by myself, which can be found in the learning section on our website. So first off, let's take a look at our model so we can see what we're working with. I've brought in all of the assembled low poly meshes here to give myself an idea of the final composition. But these aren't the meshes I'll actually use for baking. Bringing in these meshes has also imported the named materials that I assigned to them in my modeling software. To begin baking texture maps, we need to add a bake project to the scene. You can do this by going to Scene, Add Object, and then Bake Project. Baking is covered more in depth in our intro series tutorials, but I'll still give you an overview of its functionality now. With the new bake object selected, you can see there's a ton of settings which we'll be working with to get perfect bakes. Under the bake object in the scene hierarchy view, you can see that there's a bake group folder with high and low segments. Bake groups are a way of grouping together corresponding elements of your high poly and your low poly meshes so that you don't need to explode your assets prior to baking. And this is a method of avoiding intersection errors in your bakes. You can manually add meshes to these bake groups and set them up yourself, or you can make use of the quick loader. On the parent bake project in the geometry panel, press on the load button underneath the quick loader heading. With your OS browser window open, select both your high and low poly meshes together. For the quick loader to work, you need to ensure that all of the meshes and submeshes in your OBJs or FBXs have been named with an underscore at the end, followed by either high or low as needed. The quick loader will use these names to automatically name bake groups and will use the suffixes to place the corresponding meshes in the right places within said groups. So you can see from all these folders that the quick loader has done a great job of grouping everything up. I'm just going to hide this aquarium glass so we can see inside of the embalming machine. And then if I expand one of these folders, you can see that the quick loader has automatically detected which assets to match up based on my naming conventions. What's nice about this working environment as well is that I have this auto reload option enabled, so any modifications or fixes that I do to either my high or low poly models will automatically get reloaded in the scene. So I don't have to faff around with re-importing things and rearranging the bake groups. Underneath the mesh listings is the output options. This option to link multiple texture sets is going to be an absolute lifesaver for us because this diorama does use a few different materials in order to keep a good texel density across the scene. If I pull this slider down so you can see them easier, you can see that we're going to be working with at least 11 separate materials. And you can see as soon as I enable that checkbox, the bake project picks up the connected materials, giving each one its own slot and resolution settings. If I scroll back up to the top here, I'll just give a quick overview of some of the remaining settings. You have your general geometry options here for things like ignoring transforms and setting the tangent space. Generally, I leave them as default, but it's good to know that they're there if you do need to troubleshoot. So back to the output settings, and we need to set the path for our baked maps. By default, the file format will be a Photoshop file, but I'm going to switch it to Targa. The baker automatically exports output maps with the naming conventions to match the corresponding material, so I only need to put a prefix in the file name here. This can be anything you want, but usually it is good practice to have a small acronym for your project name to keep everything tidy. There's a couple of other settings that you can play with here, like the sample size and the padding amount. Now if we scroll right to the bottom, we need to decide what maps we're actually going to bake. For an initial test bake, I'll just bake out the normals and the AO, but I'm going to at least set the others up for later on. To add more maps to your bake project, click on this configure button to open up another dialog window. Here you can select all the additional maps that you want to be baked out. To make use of some of the procedural texturing tools, I'm going to add height and thickness. And I'm also adding a group ID for more granular control over colour selection. Additionally, I'm also going to check an alpha mask as we'll need this for the foliage. Newly selected maps will be automatically enabled, but I'm going to disable them for my initial test bake to reduce baking times. Next to each map here, you can see there's a cog icon. You can click on this to access map-specific settings, for example, flipping the axes of your normal map, or increasing the ray count or search distance of your ambient occlusion map. You can also add floor occlusion and have the option to ignore groups if you want separate elements to shadow each other. So time for a quick test bake to check if I've managed to set everything up right the first time. The bake's done, but currently we can't see the results to be able to know if they've come out okay or not. Next to the bake button, there's 3 circular bubbles with a H, L and P. The first 2 with the H and the L will hide your high poly groups and low poly groups respectively. The P button is for previewing your output maps on the models themselves. If you click on this, Toolbag will create a new preview material with the relevant baked maps automatically linked. Or if there's an existing material, it will link those maps up. If I hide my bake project and have a look at the assembled meshes, we can see the results of the AO and normals being applied now. The same materials are applied to the meshes in this folder, which is why the preview material has worked for these two. I'm just going to turn off local reflections and AO in the render settings, as these can add some distracting grain when navigating the viewport. In the viewport camera settings, I'm going to switch to perspective mode so that I can start zooming around my models and checking for any baking artifacts like intersection errors, skewing, or missing areas. Straight away, I can see some issues with these pebbles. The little black specks and weird artifacts are a dead giveaway that the cage isn't extending out far enough to pick up all of the pebbles in the high poly. If I expand the bake project and select the pebble mesh, I can find the bake group with them in. The low entities within each bake group have additional settings on them for adjusting and fixing projection cages and skewing. With the show offset checkbox ticked, the viewport is showing the projection cage in green. And if I turn the high poly for the pebbles back on, you can see there's a lot of them that aren't being encapsulated by the cage. To fix this, I could bump up the max offset slider here. This will push the cage out further universally. But I also have the option to paint the offset as well. This is great if there's specific areas on the model that aren't being included in the projection, but you don't want to whack the whole offset up. Clicking on this will bring up another dialog window with the UV of the mesh in question. You can begin painting directly in the viewport to increase or decrease your offset amount. Setting the value to white here will cause the cage to expand outwards, and black will recess it inwards. You can see as I paint that the values begin to appear on the canvas to correspond with the changes that I'm making. And you can also paint directly on the canvas too. To exit this painting mode, just close the canvas window and switch back to the pointer tool up here in the toolbar. You can see we've got similar issues going on with the no fishing sign here. Again, the same process, I'm going to increase the offset of the cage so that all of the lettering gets picked up. This is also a good case study for demoing how to fix slight skewing issues in your bakes. Normally, to avoid skewed details, you'd want to add control loops to your low poly models, but in Toolbag 4 we have the option to paint in skew corrections in the same way as we did the offset. If we check the Show Skew checkbox, you can now see the normal direction handles are visible on the model. Using the same painting tool to paint on the mesh, A black value will start to push the handles outward, which we want for any details being baked onto a flat surface. These affected handles will turn red to indicate the modifications. Once these offsets and skew corrections have been done, it's time to rebake and see if these fix the issues. This is looking so much better now, no clipping stones and no wonky text. So now I'm going to give my whole diorama another once over to check for any other errors. Everything seems solid, so I'm now going to enable all the other maps in the settings and bake everything out ready for texturing. While I'm in this section and I've checked my bake for errors, I'm also going to boost up the ray count for the AO so that I get a higher quality result. Obviously, if you increase the ray count, the bakes are going to take a bit longer. So you might have noticed in the last section, when I was enabling which maps I wanted to bake, that I missed out the alpha mask. And this was because I only need an alpha map for the foliage, specifically for the leaf planes. So for this texture set, the foliage material, I'm going to enable that extra map and then uncheck all the other texture sets that I don't want an alpha map baked for. Once this has baked, I need to set up transparency in the material and plug that mask in. With the foliage material selected, scroll down to the bottom of the material settings until you can see the transparency rollout. Currently it's disabled and grayed out, but we want to set it to cutout mode. To plug in the map, click on the blank square and find the newly baked mask map in your file browser. We also need to set the channel to R, G or B as we have no information in the alpha channel of this texture. As you can see though, we do have some erroring in these leaves. When encountering this error, you may jump to thinking it's caused by the alpha map settings, but this problem however lies with the baking settings. The issue is that the low poly cage isn't looking far enough to pick up the whole of the high poly leaf. This is easily fixed by increasing the max offset for all of the leaf low poly meshes. So you can see now, after rebaking, the mask is picking up the entire shape of the leaf correctly. Now we just have to rebake the rest of the maps like the normals and the AO, as they are still referencing the old bakes when the offset was incorrect. One nice thing about working with multiple texture sets is the ability to quickly set different resolutions for different materials. For example, I can set smaller assets like the fishing net or bottles to 512 pixels and keep larger or more important assets at resolutions like 1024 or 2048, which helps maintain a consistent texel density across assets. Bear in mind that these can be changed at any time, but will need rebaking in order to output the newly sized maps. Now we're ready to begin texturing our first material. It's really easy to link up the texture sets in this baker to a Toolbag texturing project. You can see all of these materials are currently unlinked, but if you expand the drop-down menu on any of the materials, then you have the option to create a new texture project. Because I selected this one, Toolbag created a new texture project in the scene with the correct naming conventions and handily linked it up to the baker. If you select the texture project, it will display a bunch of options. You can see here that there's a list of project maps and 3 output maps, the third of which makes use of channel packing to pack together AO, roughness and metalness. These output settings can of course be completely customized to your pipeline, but for this tutorial we'll be sticking with the default setup. If I scroll back up again, you can see that there's an option to work in either specular or metalness PBR pipelines, but again I will be sticking with metalness here. And above these is the list of the input maps, which is reading directly from our bake project. And then our linked material too, just so we know that this texture project is definitely synced and linked up. In the texture project settings right at the top here, you can set the resolution of the project, the viewport settings as pertaining to that particular texture, and the UV padding should you need to adjust these. With all that set up, it's time to jump into the texturing workspace and get started with texturing our diorama. I've hidden all the other meshes so that we can concentrate solely on the embalming machine without obstruction. First of all, let me briefly outline the default layout of the texturing workspace. You have your viewport, of course, but here it has been split with the right hand side showing the 2D canvas. Like any viewport in Toolbag, the canvas mode can be changed to any camera view or render mode. The materials tab stays where it normally is, but there's now an additional tab where we'll be working with our layers. And then this panel to the immediate left is where you're going to view any layer or brush settings when you have either one selected. The library is where all of the free assets that ship with Toolbag 4 are located. In here you'll find materials, brushes, skies, texture, smart masks, and smart materials. As I mentioned at the start of this video, there's comprehensive tutorials on Toolbag 4's library and workspaces in our Introduction to Toolbag 4 series. In the viewport, I'm going to switch to perspective mode again just because I don't want to alter the position of my main camera at this point in time. It's sometimes hard to know where to start when faced with an entirely blank, untextured asset, so I'm going to just jump straight in and start slapping some metal materials on the base. Thankfully, Toolbag's library has its materials categorized in the hierarchy. If I expand out the materials folder, you can see that we have a folder specifically for different types of metals. If you're using Toolbag's assets for the first time, you'll need to download them from the server in order to use them locally. If an asset has a tiny cloud icon in the top right corner, this means that it needs downloading. Double-click on the thumbnail to begin the download. The icon will turn into a spinning cog, and then will be removed entirely when the download is finished. This embalming machine is pretty old, and so I couldn't find many details on the construction materials, but I'm fairly sure that it's made out of chrome. Toolbag has a few chrome materials included. I'm going to start off with the basic chrome, and then the chrome dirty material as well. To apply materials to an asset, you can drag them straight onto the model, but I've just remembered that I haven't actually plugged my ID map into the project, and so the whole mesh is showing up white. This is easily fixed though. If I click on the blank square in the input maps, I can select the material ID map that I just baked out earlier from my file browser. Now when I drag the chrome material over the viewport, you can see that the ID map is showing up in real time. Whatever colour I drop the material onto, a layer with a corresponding layer mask will be created in the layers window. However, the chrome is fairly ubiquitous on this model and I want to layer up dirt and wear on top of it, so I'm going to use a slightly different way of masking. Instead, I'm going to drag the two chrome materials that I want to use into the layers panel, with the cleaner one on the bottom. I'm then going to make use of the grouping function. This means I can have the mask on the group rather than individual materials, which could get a little bit unwieldy. Pressing on this folder icon will create a new group in the layer stack. I can then select the two materials and drag them onto the group. You can see that an arrow now indicates that they're downline in the hierarchy from the group we've just made. I'll quickly rename the folder to keep my layers organized, very important with a project this size. And then to minimize the group, I will click on this arrow. As I mentioned, I want this chrome to be applied to multiple parts of the asset, so I'm going to click on this icon here to add a mask to the whole group. There's several options when it comes to masking: paint, color, and fill. And I'll be using the black color masks here, which creates a blank black mask. And as you can see, the chrome is no longer showing on the model. I first click on the black mask to select it, which you can see reflected by the green outline. And then we're going to go to the processes icon, which looks like a little chipset. The first option, color selection, will allow me to start picking colors from my ID map. In the drop-down menu, you can choose which map to reference if you happen to have a few different types of ID map. Then click on the Add New button to begin selecting colors. By default, the color will be white when it's added, so click on the dropper tool to pick the color from the viewport. I'll quickly time-lapse through me adding all the IDs for the chrome element. As you can see, there were quite a few elements in this model that we were applying the chrome to, which is why it's easier to have the mask on the group folder rather than individual materials that we've dragged in. So that's all done, and I'm going to switch back to viewing the layers within my group by clicking on the folder icon. We can now begin adding subtle wear and age to our chrome. Currently, the dirty chrome is applying everywhere, but I want to start working into it so that it only applies in crevices and faintly across the surface in selected places. Thankfully, we can mask within groups as well. Another way to add a mask to a layer is to right-click on the layer in question, and then select the Add Mask option. As we did before, I'm going to apply a black mask, but this time I'm going to use the curvature processor. Each processor that you might choose from this list has a bunch of tweakable parameters like intensity and contrast, and sometimes more specific ones like crevice amount, and you can adjust these in the layer settings panel. I essentially want to use this curvature processor to make sure that there's hardly any of this dirty chrome applying to the smooth outer edges. Heading back to the processors, I'm now going to add a dirt processor. It's very subtle and somewhat hard to see, but this uses input maps to again detect tight crevices and occluded areas using the AO and curvature input maps. And it's in these areas in which the dirt will be more intense. Because the case of this machine is cylindrical, I've had to put some less than hidden seams in the UVs to achieve a decent texel density. So I'm going to start making use of Toolbag's triplanar projection. This is super handy for avoiding any obvious seams in your materials. You can also adjust the tiling of the materials with these values here. And now it's just a case of me fiddling with the parameters until I get a dirt amount that I like. A lot of this is just eyeballing my photo reference and playing with the different sliders. I still want a lot of shiny chrome to come through, so this part is pretty much a balancing act of enough wear to make the asset look vintage, without going too heavy on the dirt and making it look abandoned. I still feel like this is quite a light effect, so I'm going to drag in this galvanized metal material in order to get some real rough areas. Again, switching it to triplanar and bumping up the tiling. I'm also going to adjust the colour in the albedo section here in order to lighten up this material a touch. And this is worth noting as well. Each material you bring in from the library, you can actually adjust its individual channels in the layer settings. With this galvanized metal ready to go, I'm going to take this opportunity to show you the power of smart masks. Smart masks are a collection of masks that have been set up to achieve a certain kind of effect, and are great for quickly building up certain types of wear. Toolbag's smart masks can be found in their own section in the library. To apply a smart mask, just drag your chosen one onto a blank mask in the layer stack. And what's really neat is that smart masks are still customizable once applied too. Depending on which one you choose, the parameters and processes that were used in its creation can all be adjusted like I showed previously. The galvanized metal is still not showing up as bold as I'd like, so I'm going to play with its levels. Click on this icon to access the adjustment layers. In here you have a bunch of adjustment layers such as blur, hue, saturation and levels. But for now we're just going to select the levels adjustment. The levels of the mask can then be tightened in the layer settings. You can see now the smeariness of that galvanized metal is starting to come through on the surface of the machine. This is definitely heading in the kind of direction I want, but I do want to knock it back slightly. Again, I'm going to do this with another layer in the mask, but this time I'm going to use a fill layer. With the mask still selected, click on the bucket icon to add a fill layer, and in this I'm going to slot in a grunge map. I'm going to set the blending mode of this fill layer to multiply because I want whichever texture I pick to be subtracted from the information underneath. Toolbag 4 comes with a wide selection of textures and grunge maps, which are perfect for layering up grime like this. Simply drag them into the empty slot in the fill layer settings to start adjusting. Like with the metal materials, the projection and tiling of these textures can all be customized. Additionally, I can adjust the mask intensity and the contrast. It'll take me a while to find the kind of grunge that I'm looking for, so I'm just dragging in different textures until I find one that looks kind of similar to the sort of build-up and grime that I'm seeing in my reference photos. I've actually decided that I kind of like the wipes achieved from this wipe grunge map, so I'm going to have this galvanized layer as the smudgy wipes that you commonly get on shiny chrome surfaces. Next up, some surface wear. I didn't do any sculpting on this high poly asset, so I'm going to be relying on normal information from the materials to add some subtle dints and pockmarks. This nickel pocked material is a great one. I'm going to drag it in, and then in the active map section, I'm going to disable roughness and albedo, as I don't want the information from these channels coming from this material. I want to decrease the intensity of the normal map so that these dents aren't quite as extreme. So I'm going to show you how you can modify the opacity of individual material maps. I've temporarily re-enabled the albedo map just for this example. This drop-down menu at the top of the layer window allows me to switch between the map types so that I may edit them independently of each other. If I switch to normal, you can see the canvas now shows the normal map due to it being in current map mode. By default, the opacity of all the channels are linked together. So you can see if I drop it down, then the albedo is visibly affected as well. But for this material, I want to decrease the intensity of the normal map only, so I need to click on this chain icon to disable layer linking. By decreasing the opacity of the nickel's normal map, you can see now the dents are much more subtle. I'd say that the base chrome is in a good place currently, but to make this machine look truly old, I'm going to start adding in some rusted areas. Toolbag comes with quite a few variations of rust included in the library. I quite like using this rust fine as an initial base, as it doesn't have too much contrast in colour or value. I need to turn displacement off first, as this is creating some weird bumpiness in the silhouette of my model. The rust, as it is, feels a bit too saturated to me right now. I could tweak the colour in the material settings here, but I'm going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer instead. I've just realised I'm still in the bump mode in my layers window, so I'm just switching back to albedo, as I find it easier to see which layer is which. In the adjustment layers, I'll grab a hue saturation layer and knock back those values just a touch. So, time to start working the rust into the metal. As usual, I will begin with a black fill mask, and as I do often, I'll start with a grunge map to create a base for me to work into. This grunge stains one is quite nice, as it mimics that kind of flaky look that you get when a metal rusts and its surface coating begins to peel away. The only difference here is the height information on the rust layer seems the wrong way round, but we can invert that later, that's no issue. As I've demonstrated before, I'm going to add in a dirt processor on top of this grunge map to localize some of the rust in the crevices. And then on top of that, I'm going to add a paint layer, because even the best processors and procedurals do need a touch of manual painting in order to create convincing surfacing. With the paint layer selected, I need to make sure that the paintbrush tool is also selected on this toolbar in the top left. Basic settings for the paintbrush can be altered with these sliders, but I'm going to be plugging in a brush texture instead of using the basic round brush tip. The brush textures in Toolbag are stored under the Textures section in the library. There's a bunch of different brush types and most include randomization within the strokes by using a sprite sheet. In addition to this, however, there's also brush presets which can be found in the Brushes section, but we'll touch on these a little later on in the video. I'm going to choose a grunge brush as I want to preserve the flakiness in the rust, and using a round or hard brush will likely create hard boundaries in the rust layer where it's really obvious that I've erased information. In order to apply the brush preset, navigate to the tool settings. By default, it will be docked with the scene panel, and this is where you can access and customize more advanced brush settings. Simply drag the brush preset you want into the brush texture slot in order to assign it. It's worth mentioning that I'm just using the bracket keys on my keyboard here to increase and decrease the brush tip size. This can also be achieved by holding Ctrl on your keyboard and dragging your right mouse button. In the settings, I'm going to bump up the hardness of the brush texture and adjust some of the other parameters to add more randomization to the stroke. If you expand each slider, you can add jitter values, which I love playing with to break up the uniformity of brushes. Since we want to be removing information from the mask, I need my brush set to black, and you can alternate between white and black by using X on your keyboard. Or this teardrop button will invert the color too. So I'm just going to time-lapse through this part. I'm mainly focusing on removing rust that appears to sit on the surface randomly, as this isn't really realistic. This chrome surface will start peeling away around edges and crevices, and so that's where most of the exposed rust will be concentrated. I'm quite loose when I paint out information like this, as being relaxed means you still get some flecks of rust left across the metal, which adds to believability. One thing I quickly wanted to demo is how to use your canvas to view your mask information. You can see here I have it set to albedo, which is showing only the albedo information in the material. If I click on this drop-down menu, I can set it to mask, which, as you can see, now shows the black and white information of the layer mask. This is entirely down to personal preference. I tend to work with albedo as my canvas map mostly, occasionally switching to other map channels as I need. Another alternative to switching the mask view is to switch it to the current map view instead. This is far more flexible and will automatically update depending on whether you've got a material or a mask selected. I've got rid of most of the heavy-handed corrosion, so now I'm going to add some height information back in, as it was a little bit too distracting to have enabled before. If I click back on the rust layer and scroll down in the settings, I can drop the bump value down low, which will recess the rust and make the chrome appear as a coating. With that height information added, I can see some spots of rust are still too prominent on the surface of the chrome, so I'm going to do a second pass at painting that out. And then just to tighten everything up, a levels adjustment layer to increase the contrast and remove some midway values from the mask. We've got chrome, we've got rust, but there's other types of buildup that we can start adding to this casing. I'm going to start building up some oxidation on the surface, and for that I'm going to use the anodized material. The oxidation of chrome is particularly noticeable in the recessed panel on the top of the embalming machine, so I'm going to use a dirt processor to pick out those recessions. I only want this processor to affect the curved piece on the top, so I'm going to use the paint bucket tool to quickly remove the other mesh elements from the mask. The dirt processor will still include some areas that I don't want the anodized material to apply to, so I need to use a soft basic brush to gently paint out the unwanted bits. Adding this oxidation has also made me want to get these vent holes or gratings sorted, as I want to imply that they extend into the lid rather than being capped with metal. A neat trick to faking these kind of holes in assets is to first of all add a blank fill layer. and set it to pure black and 100% rough. But then also set it to be completely metal. This means that all light is getting absorbed by this material, thus faking a hole in the mesh. I know that I've set up these vents to have their own UV islands due to the smoothing groups, so I can actually use the UV island option in the Fill Buckets application mode to easily select these sections. As you can see, now it's just a one-click solution. However, the boundary around these is now super hard and a bit unnatural looking, so I want to fade them out slightly to fake self-shadowing. If I add an occlusion layer, you can see it creates a kind of gradient around edges and crevices, and we can manipulate this to blend our mask. I'll set the blending mode to multiply and then adjust the intensity and contrast to gently blur the hard edges. With at least the first pass of the chrome casing done, I can begin to tackle the next important element, the handle. We'll be working with another material type here, which is painted wood. Toolbag comes with a diverse range of wood materials, as you can see, but for our purposes I'm going to start with this reclaimed wood material as it's quite desaturated and looks like it has a good grain to it. I'll be adding more to this wood base, but I want to get the basic paint layer on top of it first, which this paint glossy material will be ideal for. I've noticed here that some of the rust is coming through, and this is likely due to similar colours in the ID map being picked up by the colour selection in the metal mask. If I switch back quickly, I can actually drop the threshold of this yellow value, since the ID of my handle is also yellow. Not to be confused with the colour of the material that I just dropped in, that's just purely a coincidence. Before I start chipping away the paint to expose the wood underneath, I want to add some subtle discoloration to it, as plastics and paints generally fade and dull over time. I've just added in a dusty kind of material, and I'm doing my usual trick of adding a grunge map to add in some variation. Like we've seen previously, I'm just time-lapsing through me using combinations of grunge maps and level adjustments. In order to remove any obvious repetition or anomalies you might see in the mask. When zooming in, I feel like the paint is too smooth and artificial looking, so I'm going to use this plastic grainy material to add a subtle tactile texture to the surface. If I hold Alt on my keyboard while I right-click the normal channel in the layer settings, this will disable all the other maps for this material and isolate only the normal information. I feel that's helped quite a bit, so now it's just a case of me continuing to add some dust and wear to the surface of the black paint. I added this ceramic material as a base, and then added a mask with a dirt layer, into which I loaded a stained looking grunge map and adjusted the dirt settings from there. Customizing dirt layers is always important so that they don't overpower your texturing or look too slapped on. In this case, I'm using the custom grunge and intensity sliders to constrain the effect of the dirt. Here I'm just quickly jumping back to the white smears layer and adding a slight bump value and a little bit more roughness so that it clearly reads like a kind of residue on the handle. And then, as always, some custom painting to reduce the intensity of said wear. I can now start exposing some of the wood underneath because, as with the chrome and the rust, old painted things will show evidence of chips and scratches that reveal their construction material underneath. With a black mask applied, I'm going to make use of the scratch processor. I need to invert it, but you can already see it's detecting the edges, which is exactly where I'd expect more damage. Though in this case they're uniform and a bit blurred, but we'll work on that. I'm first going to increase the intensity and contrast to remove some of the softness, and then I'm going to make use of this custom grunge slot where I can plug in textures from the library. These also have intensity and contrast parameters which I can adjust for the desired effect. Similar to how we adjusted the bump value of the rust, I'm going to slightly increase the bump of the paint so that there's a subtle height variation between the base wood, as you'd expect with layers of paint in real life. Here I've added a turbulence layer from the procedural layer options. Turbulence layers are one of the procedural noise layers offered in Toolbag that create distorted directional noise information. Different noise types cause different effects. In the case of turbulence, you can expect sharp valleys and peaks in the values, causing quite a high contrast. I personally use them just to knock some information out of masks. In this case, I'm using the noise to create a more haphazard chipped effect to the paint damage. I'm going to use the dial face here to quickly teach you how to load your own alphas into the brush, as this is an important concept for adding things like narrative detailing or branding to your models. I've already applied a basic plastic material to the face. For the barometer detailing, I'm going to add a basic fill layer set to the colour that I want the measurements to be. With a black mask and paint layer applied and the brush tools selected, in the tool settings I can click on the blank square in the brush texture field to bring up my file explorer. You can see here there's an alpha image for the barometer dial that I've already made in black and white in Photoshop. And if I load it, this alpha is now applied to my brush tip. To stamp it on, I simply set the hardness to full, increase the size based on what I can see in the viewport, and click on the dial face to stamp in the brush. And then finally, I'm just adding a tiny bit of height information to improve the readability of the decal. To texture the dial plate, I'm going to be using the exact same process as I did with the wooden handle, so I'll time-lapse through me adding the basic plastic material. However, I don't want this plate quite as chipped as the handle. I want a more worn away and scuffed look. So you can see here I'm just using a glossy plastic layer and a rougher rubber sort of material to add some microsurface variation. And then a combination of a scratch processor and grunge maps to localize the wear to the convex edges. Getting some branding in is integral in grounding our prop and giving it some real-world context, and we can start with this metal plaque at the front. I'm going to grab the same anodized material that we used earlier for the dark oxidization, as my references show a kind of similar build-up in the embossed details. With a fresh black mask applied and the layer appropriately renamed, because I like tidiness, I'm going to add a paint layer, and then, like we did with the dial face, I'm going to grab an alpha that I've previously made and apply it to my brush tip. I've just made up a company name here. It's a good thing to do to avoid any legal trouble. And then, as before, increase the hardness and use the bracket keys on my keyboard until the brush tip size seems to match the size of the mesh relatively well. I press a couple of times to stamp in the alpha, and then I have a company name. Though currently the height information is the opposite of what we want, so in the material settings, drop down the bump and displacement values until the logo appears as negative embossing. I'm just chucking on a levels adjustment layer to tighten up the edges, and a sharpen adjustment too for good measure. Time to turn our attention to the rubber tubing on the side, and I'm going to tackle the exposed port first. From looking at photo references, it appears that the metal around the connectors is kind of tarnished, so I'm going to use brass materials to add some discoloration. I'm going to start with this dirty brass and lighten up the albedo so it's not as intense, and tint it a little bit more yellow. And then simply layer up a dirt processor and painted information until I've applied the tarnishing to the areas that make the most sense. One neat feature I want to show you I can demo with these rubber rings along the length of the attachment. If I apply a rubber layer with the paint layer in the mask selected, I can use this rectangular selection tool to select parts of the mesh in the viewport. For this to work properly, you need to make sure backface culling is set all the way to 180 degrees in the tool settings so that the back faces are included. You might have noticed that I switched to the front camera view so that I could line up the marquee selection perfectly. It has accidentally selected some parts of the rubber tube behind, but this isn't a problem because I'm just going to be using the paintbrush tool to paint the mask information in. You can see with parts of the mesh selected like this, when I paint it's constrained to these areas, which makes it super handy when trying to paint finicky details or things with very clear boundaries. I don't want to take too much time on the rubber tubing due to it being a relatively minor element and quite thin too, so I'm going to use this to demo smart materials. Smart materials are a quick way to add specific surface types to your models and can be an excellent way to speed up your workflow. Thankfully, there's a few different rubber smart materials already included in Toolbag's library. I'm going to go with this rubber coating scratched, as a few of the others look a little too aged and damaged for our purposes. Once downloaded, I'm just dragging it onto my mesh like I would a normal material. You can drag smart materials straight into the layer panels too, of course. Smart materials are basically presets that have a bunch of layers and masks inside them, and these are all tweakable, which means you can still customize your smart materials as needed. The base is going to be very similar to the way that I approached the handle, so much so that I'm actually duplicating the handle folder and renaming it and remasking it as required. The main difference I want to call out is that I decided to act a layer to act as a primer. This is where objects are painted with a white primer before their final coat, and as paint is chipped away, you can see specks of the primer showing up around the chipped edges. I'll start by adding a paint flat material and setting it to a pale desaturated colour. And then I'm just using a scratch processor with custom grunge and scratch maps to wonky up the edges. Making sure to add a touch of height information with the bump value too, so that the primer appears raised off the base wood. And then once I'm happy, I'm going to create a smart mask out of this so that I can apply the same masked wear to the black top coat. I simply drag the newly created smart mask onto the black paint material that I dragged in earlier and adjust the levels slightly so that more of the primer is revealed around the edges. You could also choose to save out this smart mask to your library or to your OS files for reuse in other projects. Final touches involve a quick pass over with a paintbrush on both the primer and paint layers to remove unnecessary noise, and that's the base done. We looked at smart materials for the pipe connector, but we can actually also make our own, and I think this chipped painted base would be a great example. A lot of assets I make tend to have some elements of painted wood, and so it would be super quick to reuse this in the future. It's easy enough to do. First of all, we need to delete the mask temporarily, since this mask is specific to the asset. Then simply right click on the group in which we've textured the base. Then save our smart material. In this dialog window, you can give it a name, author info, and tags. There's also the option to export groups as smart materials. Like with the masks, this will export the material file out to your file explorer. One of the final little touches to show off is the handwritten paper sticker with measurements that sits on top of the glass. Obviously, the glass is a separate material set and is hidden at the moment so as to not be too distracting. I'm going to begin with a basic paper layer. As with other material types, Toolbag comes with quite a range of paper and card base materials to work with. My photo references show that paper stickers like this do end up quite sun bleached, so I'm going to lighten the colour up a bit. And then for extra age, I'm going to drag in this crinkled paper material because I want to make use of its normal information. We've done it before, so I'll only mention it briefly, but I disable all maps except the normal and bump maps, and then increase the tiling and decrease the opacity of the layer until I get a very subtle rumpled look to the sticker. I'm then just going to add a dirt layer and have this dirt or dust more localized around the edges. I kind of imagine them having peeled away slightly and the grime getting stuck to the exposed adhesive, so that's kind of what I'm going for. With the paper base done, I can now add in the little hand-drawn measurement lines. I'm just adding a fill layer here, setting the colour of the ink that I want to use, which is blue in this case. You could draw the lines by hand within Toolbag with the paintbrush and a suitable pencil-esque brush texture, but for quickness sake, I'm just bringing in an alpha I've already made to match the aspect ratio of the sticker. As before, I could stamp the alpha into the viewport, but with this being such a thin piece of mesh, I'm actually going to split my viewport and have the second one display my canvas. Here I can find the UV island of the sticker and use this to better eyeball what size to have my brush. Stamp it in, and then because I realised I have my alpha inverted, I'm going to stick on an invert adjustment layer. To add an extra lick of realism, I can see from my references that ink fades unevenly. So I'm going to add a subtle grunge map on top of the mask just to fade the ink away in patches so that it's not a completely solid colour. We've used brush textures a lot in this tutorial so far, but one thing that we haven't looked at yet are the brush presets. Brush presets are stored in their own brushes section in the library. There's two categories here: organic, where you'll find brushes set up for painting in dirt, for example, and nuts and bolts, which you can use to stamp in hard surface detailing, like screws and bolts onto your model. This removes the need to have tiny details like these in the high poly. To use one of these presets, create a new paint layer and make sure your paintbrush tool is selected. Then, like with the brush textures, you can drag any of the brush presets into the tool settings. You can see now the layer settings have changed. There's a whole bunch of maps now applied to the brush. Now I can find a suitable place on my model and stamp in a screw. There's multiple variations of nuts and bolts included in Toolbag 4, so definitely play around with these in your projects. I'm sure you've had enough of watching me play about with chrome and rust now, so we're going to move on to our second texture set, the aquarium assets. First thing we need to do is create a texture project for it. As we did for the embalming machine, open up the bake project and scroll down to the texture set lists. Use the drop-down menu in the texture project link to create a new project, and as you can see, this will create a second texture project in the scene outliner. I'm going to remove this scatter map as I know we won't be using any subsurface scattering for these props. The aquarium plant will, but they have their own material. So now I'm just going to hide all the other assets so again we can see what we're doing a little easier. With this material set having a few different elements within it, all with different kinds of surface types, I'm starting this texture project by just blocking in the folders and masks with basic fill colours. For the no fishing sign, I'll begin by blocking in just a flat brown fill colour so I can set up the mask with my object ID map. As you can see, I baked 3 different ID maps. The object ID map in this case just registers individual objects in your high poly, which is useful for selecting separated objects. And so now it's just a case of me repeating this until I've got my folder structure set up completely. The pebbles need an additional layer of masking as I want to have 3 or 4 different colours of pebbles making up the gravel. I want the inside of the aquarium to really pop with colour and have potentially some neon elements. So as you can see, I'm just setting up another 4 folders within the pebbles folder and using the same object ID map to select which grouping of stones I want which colour to affect. I'm not too worried about the colours at this point as I'll probably tweak them as I go. So the no fishing sign and to be honest all of the aquarium assets are tricky things to texture, as even in real life they're quite artificial and so therefore have that fake toy-like look to them. And sometimes achieving that in 3D convincingly can be difficult. But we'll start with sticking some wood onto the base of the sign. I'm going to begin with this lumber rough hewn as it's very fibrous and almost has a kind of stylized look to it already. There's going to be 2 directions of wood grain here, so I'll set up 2 folders for horizontal grain and vertical grain. You can alleviate this step by, in your UV mapping stage, have the direction of your UV shells normalized, but in this case I annoyingly didn't do that, so we'll just set up the 2 different folders. I'm going to bump up the tiling and then use my levels and sharpen adjustment layers to really intensify the wood grain and the fibres. With the levels, I'm disabling all of the active maps apart from albedo, so that only the colour information gets affected and none of the normal or bump information does. I also want to add some lightened edges to the wood, and you see this a lot on stylized 3D art as it can really help make things pop. I think it'll also lend itself well to the kind of artificial look that we're going for. So I'm just using a pale beige fill layer and adding a curvature layer to the mask from the processes menu. Inside its generator settings, I'm adjusting the parameters until I get a result that concentrates that pale colour around the edge, and in order to soften it up, I'm just sticking a blur layer on top. Here I'm just adding some subtle yellow tones to the base, again just a basic fill layer with some grunge maps in the mask. Colour variations are imperative for not ending up with really flat, unconvincing textures. And then adding some faked AO with a dark brown fill layer, because in my references it looks like the dark varnish or paint that they were using has collected around the lettering, so I want to emulate that. With colour tweaks like these, I usually play around with blending modes as I only want these to be very subtle tints. Now, to achieve the fake looking wood grain I can see in aquarium decorations like this, I'm going to add an extra dirt processor to that AO layer and adjust the global and crevice intensity until I really see it starting to intensify in the gouged out grain. This is a decent base, so I'm going to duplicate this horizontal folder so that I can apply it to the signpost. And now I need to rotate all the layers using any directional kind of materials or grunges by 90 degrees so that they're now vertically aligned. Here I'm just adding on another dirt processor which I'll use to exaggerate the wood grain even further. And the dark gradient around the lettering, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a collection of old varnish. The colour selection mask isn't producing quite as perfect a result as I want currently due to the aliasing. I've tried improving it with the levels adjustment, but I ended up relenting and just using the brush tool to manually paint out the white pixels, which is something you have to do sometimes with masks. I'm going to move on to these urchins now, and like with the other aquarium assets, these are going to look kind of artificial rather than like the real life organisms. I'm going to time-lapse through most of this process as I'm just using fill layers to build up colour variations and gradients across the surface. Though one processor I'll quickly show off just because we haven't used it yet is the direction layer. This layer uses positional data from the bakes to add mask information. In this case, I'm using it to apply this reddish pink colour as a gradient from the top of the urchins. And now it's just a case of me painting in more colours. The reference I have shows the fake urchins having a range of pastel colours, greens, pinks and lilacs, and some brown accents too, so this step is actually quite similar to doing stylized hand-painted texturing. With the base colour information in, I'm now going to start adding some surface detail to the urchins so that they don't look too out of place in an otherwise realistic scene. In the library, I'm going to search for rock materials with the intention of using some of their normal and microsurface information to break up the smooth surfaces. This porous rock material is ideal. If I increase the tiling amount, you can see it adds a subtle but noticeable high frequency bumpiness to the urchins, which helps to sell that they're made of some sort of ceramic or clay. And then just to boost this even further, I'm going to use the bedrock material with the albedo disabled to add some softer and larger form undulations. So we had a sneak peek at some of the rock materials that Toolbag offers just a moment ago, but now it's time to focus on them properly with the aquarium rocks at the back. Again, as with the 2 aquarium pieces we've done up to now, the references I'm using for these rocks are artificial recreations, usually because dumping real rocks in an aquarium can introduce bacteria or harmful agents to the tank residents. I first need to choose a material that's going to act as the fundamental base for this rock, so I'm just dragging in various rock materials from the library until I find one that seems the closest to my reference photos. Again, the porous rock material is a winner here. It creates a kind of pockmarked surface, which is exactly what I'm going for. Though it is a little ubiquitous across the whole mesh at the moment, So I'm going to mask it off with a procedural turbulence layer to create some areas of rest. Turbulence layers are one of the procedural noise layers offered in Toolbag that offer distorted directional noise information. I use them to knock some information out of masks, much like you would with a texture map, but you can create all sorts of effects by layering up and modifying procedural noises. I've then combined it with a desaturated bedrock material to give myself a solid base. It's always a good idea to pick out edges with a pale colour when texturing rocks, which I'm doing by taking the perforated rock layer, which luckily is already a lot lighter in value, and adding a scratch layer from the processes. I'm then going to clone this layer, clear the mask, and add a grunge map instead. This just helps bring some of that pale desaturated material into the rest of the rock surface, which can help blend those edges into the rest of the asset, rather than being really obviously separated. As with the urchins and the no fishing sign, I'm just continuing to layer up colour information, normal information, and faking shadows and build up in the cavities. The last step I'll do is to add some white flecks across the surface. I love adding little imperfections like these. I think it can really help to make a model feel more organic and natural. And I'm just using the sparse lichen grunge map and then loosely painting out areas until I get an intensity that I'm happy with. With the rock all done, I want to move on to the pebbles as the primary colours are starting to really bother me and I don't feel like they're in sync with the rest of the aquarium's colour palette. As we did with the urchins, I'm going to start by adding in some normal information. I've settled on using this concrete pebble dash material. With a high tiling intensity, it adds that kind of graininess that you get in gravel. This is a good start, but I want more of an obvious microsurface variation, that kind of sparkly effect that you can get with quartz. So I'm going to use the gravel small material for this. Again, ramp up the tiling. And disable the albedo to remove colour information. I'm then using the levels adjustment layer to really increase the contrast of the roughness here. If I switch to the roughness mode in the viewport, you can see I now have a lot of speckly information in that map channel. With the groundwork set up, I'm going to start altering the colours because, as I said, these bold primary colours are really not the look that I'm going for. I actually want to have some glowing stones in the pebbles as I think this will work nicely with the glass and water with the ray tracing. First of all, to do this, I need to add an emissive map to the project maps in the texture project. And then while I'm here, I'm going to also set up an emissive output map so that this could be plugged into an engine when exported. On this base layer at the very bottom of the layer stack, I'm just making sure that the emissive value is set to black, so that there's no wayward glowing anywhere else in the model. I know I want one set of the stones to stay as black with no glow, to act as a contrast to the others. I'm going to go with very typical neon style colours, blues and pinks and teals, because I also think these are the kind of hues that you associate with aquariums. To add a little more variation, I'm just cloning the pink layer here and masking it off with a speckled grunge map. Because the glow of the emissive will obscure some of the roughness variation that we set up, having this variation in the glow will just help support that grainy look that we're after. And then obviously repeat this for the other stone colours as well. While not strictly PBR correct, I'm going to add in this dark fill layer with no emissive information. With a black mask applied, I'm setting up a scratch layer so that the cavities between the pebbles are picked out. After adding a blur layer to this, you can see this helps to boost the separation between the pebbles and improve readability. I'm going to sneak in another little bit of fakery by emulating bounced lighting on the underside of the rock faces, as if it was coming up from the glowing pebbles. While ray tracing will do an excellent job of bouncing the lighting around the aquarium, I want to use artistic license just to exaggerate it a touch. Back in the rock group, I'm going to add an emissive only layer and set the colour to a dark purplish pink. I'm then making use of the direction layer that we used earlier in the urchins and inverting it to start isolating this glow to the underhangs. The intensity of the glow obviously will decrease with distance from the stones, so I'm just using my paint tool to remove some of the information near the peak. Since we're fully committing to the neon theme now, I've got to include the little urchins. There's no different process to show here really, but I just wanted to give an example of how I continuously switch back and forth between assets to tweak colours and materials as I go. I want the knobbly extrusions to have a nice glow to them, so I'm sticking on a bright cyan colour as I've not really touched that colour yet in the scheme. I'm then just adding in some pinks and lilacs to tie the colour scheme in with the pebbles, and then just tweaking levels and paint layers until I get a nice complementary accent. With the neon additions in, if I head to my scene panel and select my default sky option, you can preview how these glowing elements might look by dropping down the brightness of the sky. This is only a quick preview because to get the full effect of the shot, I'm actually going to set up some additional skies with nighttime HDRIs, but I'll be doing that at the end of the project when I'm ready to render, rather than right now because we still have quite a lot of texturing to get through. We're going to leave the foliage inside the aquarium for a while and instead focus on the trolley, as that's the next real significant thing in this diorama. As we've done before, I'm making a new texture project for the trolley. The shells in this 1950s era trolley are glass, and so we're going to need to add some specific maps to the project that can handle refraction and transmission, as these two factors are imperative for working with transparent objects when using ray tracing. I need to make some amendments to the material itself too. With the trolley material selected, in the transmission section, switch the mode to refraction. And then back in the texture workspace, I'm beginning, as I always do, with setting up my folder structure and masks. In the glass folder, I'm dragging in a basic glass material from Toolbag's library. Transparent objects, when using transmission masks and refraction, will look a little bit weird in the viewport when in raster rendering mode, but don't fret because when ray tracing is turned on, they'll render out properly. It is a bit distracting at this moment in time though, so I'm just going to hide the glass folder for now. Continuing with my setup, there's 4 main elements to the trolley: the glass shelves, the frame, the rubber of the wheels, and the tiny foam pieces that the glass shelves rest upon. We've worked with metals before, so we have a good idea of the types offered in Toolbag's library. I'm going to start with this dented aluminium material as it's fairly flat and not too shiny. Though upon zooming in, I do want a little more glossiness in the surface, so I'm going to pull in the chrome material. And then mask off the rougher aluminium with a subtle cloudy grunge. With this being old and vintage, I want to get some subtle surface damage in as well. I thought the hammered copper might be a good material to try, but that's more decorative than damaged, so I'm just going to make use of the dented aluminium material again. I don't want these gouges all over the place, so I'm removing some info as necessary to keep the effect sporadic. With the base metal done, I'm now going to start adding the painted coating. I'll create a new folder as I'm going to want to use multiple layers and masks for this. The iron painted material is an excellent starting point. It has really nice roughness and subtle normal information that kind of break up the surface. Though I definitely want to change the colour, I'm going with a mint green since it's a little more in keeping with the aquarium colours. As with the base metal, I'm going to add in an additional glossy paint layer and mix this with the rougher painted iron to soften out the surface. You can expect paint on an item like this to wear away more on the exposed edges and places where it's most likely to be knocked, so I'm using my favourite scratch processor to start exposing some of the bare metal underneath. But processors and adjustment layers alone won't achieve the specific kind of wear and tear that I'm after, so a lot of this step involves manually painting in the damage that I want. Similar to the chrome coating on the embalming machine, I'm going to quickly add in some height information to make it clear that this paint sits on top of the metal. This will also help inform how heavy to go with the damage. And then it's back to painting. This is actually a good time to demo the scratch brushes. While the grunge brushes that I was using are great for taking out big chunks, you can also expect that some of the paint has been scratched away near exposed areas. And these scratch brush textures are great for adding in that kind of variation quickly. So up to now, the metal that I've been exposing has been quite harsh and flaky looking, but with painted metal poles like this, you often also get a smoother, more gradual wearing away of the paint as well. You can imagine this being on things like handrails in public transport, where a lot of hands over time have softly worn away the paint. To emulate this, I'm going to make a second folder for metal on top of the other two folders. I want a sort of rough oxidized metal for this, so I'm opting for the iron polished material. And I'll just brighten it up a bit and add in some extra roughness. I'm then going to start painting this in where I want this kind of wear applied. I'm speeding this part up, but I'm essentially just using one of the rust brushes with a low hardness value and a reduced opacity to start softly painting in the exposed metal. The contrast between paint and metal is still a bit extreme for my liking though, so I'm going to overlay some grunge maps so that there's still remnants of the green paint pulled in throughout. This directional dirt map is perfect, as you can imagine the paint's kind of been worn away by things leaking down the legs or them being wiped down while cleaning. And then I'm going to start blending in this metal with the harsh chipped away areas that we did earlier. This is just a process of trial and error. I still want to preserve some of the chipped edges, so it's just a case of manually painting until I'm happy with the look, using X to continuously switch between black and white in my brush. We've got most of the extreme wear and tear in now, so I'm just going to start adding in some discoloration to the paint. Again, this is a concept I've gone over previously, but surfaces don't degrade and age universally. There will be some areas that discolor or fade quicker than others, and some stainage from human intervention as well. I'm going to use fill layers here just to add some subtle yellow and faded green tones to the paint. They're barely perceptible, but I find it helps with the authenticity of the surface, even if you can't immediately discern these additions. The last element we need to get into this trolley frame is the rust, and I do usually leave this until last, as I like my paint and metal to be as close to final as possible. I'm going to use this abraded rust material here rather than the fine rust we used in the embalming machine, because I imagine the bottom of this trolley to have been exposed to more elements and less cared for than something that would sit at eye level. As always, drop the transmission mask so that this isn't rendering as see-through. I'm actually going to just paint most of this rust in rather than relying on processes, as I want it in very particular places and there's only a very small amount of corrosion present. Mostly I want it near the base of the legs here. You can imagine that where this leg is slotted into the metal connector of the wheel, the casing would slowly rub away any paint and coating on the leg, therefore exposing the base metal and speeding up how quickly it corrodes. As we did on the embalming machine, I'll drop the bump value so that the rust appears slightly recessed. And then, as I'm sure you've noticed I do a lot, I'm adding a procedural turbulence to the paint mask we've just made in order to break up the hard shapes. If we left all the rust concentrated at the bottom, it might look a little odd that there's none present anywhere else. So I'm duplicating the rust folder so that we have a secondary set of rust sitting on top of all the metal and paint layers. I'm going to clear the mask first and then start building up some flecks of rust across the surface of the trolley frame using a grunge map. This rust surface fine in particular because it gives a real nice speckled base to work with. It's then just the same process of masking off that grunge map, using stacked masks, so that there's just a very subtle scattering of rust across the surface that works in tandem with the worn metal and scratches that we've already got in. I think we're at a good point to start looking at the other elements that make up the trolley asset now, so I'm going to move on to the wheels and their casing. I'll start with the metal casing before moving on to the wheels themselves. There's no new processes here, so I'll just talk you through my general approach and thought processes as I get these bits textured. Similar to how we started building up the embalming machine, I'm going to use both a slightly shiny aluminium material and a more corroded material to build up the base for these casings. As you can see, I'm just using dirt and occlusion processor layers to build up a patina across the surface. I'm just pulling in a bunch of worn and shiny metals. The polished iron will stay constrained to edges to keep the nice roughness response where the light catches them. Using a large grungy brush, I'm painting in some more concentrated oxidation around the crevices at the top, and then I'm also using it to reduce some of the grime on the sides for a more natural look. So onto the rubber for the wheels now. We did look at rubber for the tubing of the embalming machine if you remember. But I'm not going to use that material this time as I want to follow the reference closely, and it looks to be a harder, more industrial kind of rubber. So I'll start by bringing in this plain black rubber material so we have a clean base to build up from. I quite like this rubber material as it has a good level of subtle microsurface detail that reacts well with the lighting. And then I need to get in the plastic sides as well. This again is a good opportunity to get another splash of colour into the scene. Wheels by nature are quite dirty due to them being in contact with the ground and in constant motion when used, so I'm going to really push the dirt and dust here. Using the dirt ground material with a dirt processor in the mask, I'm just following the same steps that I have previously to start getting in some of that dusty buildup. Concentrating it mainly around the crevices, but also leaving a touch of it on the surfaces as well. So we get that nice roughness response to the rubber. You also expect to see scuffs or drag marks on the wheels, especially when the rubber is dark, like with this example. To add this, I'm beginning with a clean concrete material. Not because the scuffs are made of concrete, but because I can tinker with this to create a lightly coloured chalky residue. There's quite a few streaky and leaky grunge maps that I think will be good for creating these scuffs. The wipes didn't have quite the effect that I wanted, but this heavy brushed stains map is perfect for creating the smears. I'm then adding a paint layer set to multiply and using the fill bucket tool to paint it all black. This means I can then use my brush tool, set to white, to slowly introduce the scuffs back in as I want them localized to the tread of the wheel. And this is just where it's in contact with the floor. Only one part of the trolley left to do now before we revisit the glass, and that's these foam cushions that the glass rests upon. Fortunately, Toolbag comes with the perfect material for this, the polyurethane foam, and that did take me a few attempts to try and pronounce correctly. I'm dragging that in and upping the tiling. Then, because foam especially is bad for showing its age, I'm adding a white fill layer with a curvature layer in the mask to fade some of the edges. Conversely, I'm then using a black fill layer with the curvature layer inverted to emphasize the recessed parts. So back to the glass, as this is arguably one of the most important parts of the trolley asset, especially for when we want to start playing with ray tracing and grabbing our final renders. If you haven't already, make sure you switch the transmission mode of the material to refraction, and then additionally, if you scroll down further, you need to switch your reflectivity mode to refractive index. As I mentioned previously in this tutorial, there's more detailed information about these settings on our website and in our introduction to Toolbag 4 videos. And these will talk you through the concept and theory of ray tracing and refraction and advanced shaders in more detail. So you can see now that this shelf is registering as glass, though as I highlighted earlier, it will look a little weird while we're in raster rendering mode. Mainly these black gradients across the shading, though rest assured that the shelves will not display like these once we turn ray tracing on. So for this glass surface, I don't want to keep it as pristine as this. I want to build up some grime and some residue. If you imagine a glass coffee table, you expect to see things like cup rings, fingerprints, and smears from it being wiped down, and these are exactly the kind of little touches that I want to get into this trolley. I'll begin just by getting some dirt in, as this is going to be the heaviest of the grime that I'll be adding. Make sure to turn down the transmission values on any dirt sitting on top of the glass, or you could end up with some very strange shading. The dirt processor does create a good starting point, but as with the rust on the trolley, I want this build up in very specific places, and so I find it easier to just manually paint in the locations of the dust. I'm mainly keeping it concentrated around the leg areas and under the base of the embalming machine, as if it's been sat in the same place for a while. I'm just keeping this dirt very subtle. You want to barely be able to see it. You kind of just want it breaking up the shiny surface of the shelves. Now for the smudgy wipes. I'm adding a fill layer with only albedo, roughness and transmission enabled in the active maps. And for now I'm setting the albedo to red. This red will not be staying, it's purely acting as a guide layer so I can see where I'm applying the wipes more easily. There's quite a few wipe themed grunge maps in the library, which is great for adding variation to glossy surfaces. For this glass, I'm gonna go with the wipes surface as they look to be quite circular in shape and large in size, perfect for emulating the kind of residue you'd expect to be left behind from someone cleaning this trolley. As we did with the scuffs on the wheel, I'm then adding a paint layer, filling it with a black colour via the paint bucket tool. Realised I've forgotten to set it to multiply, and then using the paintbrush tool set to white to start painting the wipes back in. This means I can blend the wipes into the otherwise glossy surface and avoid any hard transitions. It's the same kind of approach to the fingerprints. Toolbag comes with a few different fingerprint grunge maps, heavy, light and medium. The heavy fingerprints seem to work best with the wipes in my opinion. And then exactly as we've just done, I first mask away all of them and then begin painting patches of grubby fingerprints back in where I think they make the most sense. The last category of residue that I want to add to the glass is some droplets of water, presumably from the bottles of liquid or the aquarium. Again, I'm making a new fill layer with a red albedo as a guide, just initially. And this bit I'm going to do entirely by hand as water droplets can be very specific in shape and location, depending where they came from and how they fell. I'm also increasing the bump values so that they appear raised and rounded as you'd expect. I'm sure you've observed if you've spilled water yourself. It does sit as a kind of dome over whatever surface it's on. And then as you can see, I'm just time-lapsing through me painting in little puddles of water, especially near the base of the embalming machine aquarium. With the trolley done, I'm now going to take you through how I textured the aquarium plants. As always, begin by making a new texture project for the plants material. For a change though, we do actually want the scatter map enabled in the project map, as we'll be using subsurface scattering for the leaves. I'll begin by setting up my folders. There's two types of plants included in the atlas that I set up in the UVs, and each have two leaf variants. If I navigate quickly to the baking meshes, you can see I have 4 planes for the 4 leaves, and also a cylinder which acts as the stem trim in the texture. I've masked the 2 plant types off and put on a basic fill layer for each, with the thinner leaves being slightly more yellow. Toolbag's library comes with a vegetation category in the materials, which you can see I have selected in my library panel, and this is going to be a great help for texturing these aquatic plants. I want to begin by adding some subtle surface texture to the leaves, like with the aquarium assets we made in the second chapter of the tutorial. These plants are likely fake plastic ones and so will have emphasized surface texture compared to their real life counterparts. I'm disabling all active maps except normal and bump, and dropping the contrast of both to weaken the effect so it's not dominating the surface. I actually think I might enable the roughness map again to get in some microsurface variation as well. Most plants, and especially these, as I said, artificial ones, have lighter edges where the plastic is thinner. And so the subsurface scattering is more obvious where the light diffuses around the edges. To replicate this, I'm adding another fill layer, more yellow in colour than the current green, with only albedo and scatter maps enabled. And then I'm just using the scratch layer processor in the mask to constrain it to the leaf edges. Likewise, I'm creating a third, darker fill layer, which will boost the cavities of the leaf veins. I'll be using a curvature layer in the mask here instead, though this does include edges in its result, which I'll paint out by hand. I'm then adding this slime layer for more surface breakup. I'm not concerned with what the material is on paper, I just want to use its normal and colour information. I would like a subtle gradient going down the length of the thinner leaves, so I'm going to use the same approach as I did with the leaf edges. Again, another fill layer, quite yellow this time, with only albedo and scatter maps enabled. I'm then, in the layer mask, going to use a basic soft round brush to paint in a gradient from the leaf tip. These colour variations just help to add a bit of visual interest and organic variation to the leaves, which will be important when there's a whole bunch of them arranged into a plant. And again, I'll reiterate, this is a very simple look at using subsurface scattering. If you were to do more realistic PBR plants, there would be a few more steps than this, and you'd probably spend a little bit longer building up the albedo and the normal maps, and potentially using scan data as well. It's been a long journey so far, but the end is in sight. We now need to turn our attention to the bottle crate, which also includes the glass bottles in the same UV space. With a fifth texture project created, I'm disabling the displacement map from the project maps, as I know we won't be using it, and it might introduce some artifacts into our models. As with the trolley, I'm going to add a transmission mask map as well, because the bottles will be using a glass material, but the wood is entirely opaque and dielectric. I'm going to approach the crate itself first and save the bottles until last. There's a few different objects included in this material, so I'm using the object ID in the colour selection layer to pick out the parts of the wooden crate. Now, the wood used in these kinds of vintage shipping crates is generally rough and untreated, and that has only been emphasised over time. I'm just dragging in a few wood materials to get a sense of which direction I want to go in. This reclaimed material is going to be a great base because it's suitably smooth in terms of normal information, but it still retains fibrous and wood grain information in the albedo. You can see if I bump up the tiling amount, there's an ideal amount of knots in the wood as well. Though I definitely think UV projection is better here than triplanar. I've just noticed my sky is a little dark, probably from me checking out the emissive values in the aquarium. So I'm going to boost that back to 1 so we can actually see what I'm doing. Generally, when I'm making a wooden asset, I'll start with a base wood material, as I have done here. And then I start to use other wooden materials to add patches of discoloration and extra grain, which is what I'm starting to do with this rough hewn lumber. I need to fade off the edges too, kind of like we did with the rock in the aquarium. You do generally see that aged wood fades quickest along the edges, perhaps where the varnish has rubbed off more easily. and this also aids with readability. I want to strengthen the wood grain in some places, get some splits in there to sell the crate's age, so I'm going to make use of this cracked pine material. As we've done before, Alt and right click on the normal map in the active maps to isolate it. You can see after I've played with the normal map contrast and the tiling, there's some real nice gouges in this. I don't want them ubiquitous though, so I'm going to add a plain black mask. And I'm starting to paint in areas that I do want this extreme wood grain coming through. They make the most sense placed near the edges where the sides of the crates are joined via box joints, and around the handles too. Anywhere the wood has already been cut or processed, as that's where it's going to be the weakest. Though I am including some on the surfaces as well. And you can hopefully see that these have added a sense of age and surface damage to the crate without us having to sculpt any of that information into the high poly. I'm not currently happy with how the box joints are reading, so I'm going to boost the cavities a bit, using a black fill layer and an occlusion processor in the mask. If I toggle the visibility of this layer now, you can see it just helps to separate the construction of the wood. Okay, the base is pretty much done, so now it's time to dirty up this crate and get some real interesting buildup of grime. I've noticed in my photo references that there's some real dark grungy patches across the surface of the wood, perhaps from mud or motor oil or smudged ink, but I definitely want to include this for visual interest. I'm just using a soil material here that I've tweaked and darkened, and then I'm using this sweeping grunge map in the mask as it has a lovely balance of specks and light blended smudging. I'm combining a few different grunge maps as there's a very specific look to this dirt that I'm after, and I want an element of directionality to it as well so that it complements the wood grain. With that set up, I can mask it out and begin painting in grungy patches. I'm using a super low opacity brush here because I want to build the grunge up slowly so as to not overdo it or overpower the appearance of the whole crate. Now it's time for one of my favourite bits, getting the stencils and detailing into the wood. First up, I'm going to create a fill layer with the colour of stencil paint that I want, because we'll be using the alpha method again for these labels. I'm splitting my viewport and then undocking my second window so that it's floating. I would normally have this on a second screen for ease of use, but obviously with me recording, it has to float on top for now. I'm setting the viewport mode to ambient occlusion simply because it gives me the best idea of how my UVs are laid out. I can see the box joints and the wood grain coming through, which kind of gives me an idea of context. With the brush tool selected in the tool settings panel, I'm going to load one of the alphas that I created earlier. I then increase the size and the hardness of the brush tip, and I'm also setting the projection mode to UV, as this might make it a bit easier to eyeball the size of the brush when I'm in canvas mode. And then it's just a case of clicking right where you want the stencil to appear. And now actually I take it all back, I've changed my mind and I'm going to apply this alpha in the viewport instead, as I apparently have terrible spatial awareness and was struggling to centralize it without the brush guide. But I just wanted to leave that section in so that you're aware that working in your canvas is an option. With that applied to the mask, I'm going to decrease the bump value of the fill layer so that the text seems stamped into the wood and appears recessed. This is a good start, but I want to get some red in here to break up the wall of text that we've got going on. I'm just going to do this quickly by duplicating the fill layer, changing the albedo and then adjusting the masks as needed. So I'm just painting out the red text from the black fill layer mask and vice versa. You'd expect with the amount of age and weathering that we've added elsewhere to the crate that the stencils wouldn't have remained in perfect condition either. So a final touch is to add a bit of flaky grunge to the mask with this sponged dust grunge map. One detail I think is going to really sell the processed look of this wooden crate is the manufacturing lines. These kind of stripes along the surface of the wood that I assume is from the machines used to cut and sand it. So I'm just adding a basic fill layer for now, but then I'm going to use this chance to demo another Toolbag layer type, which is the tile generator. This is a really powerful processor type with a lot of options to customize the size and shape of your tiles. For my situation, I'm going to adjust these options until I get stripes going across the surface, which I've done by maxing out the tile height and also upping the tile count. And then I'm just going to stick on an invert layer so that the thin stripes are the ones that are appearing darker on the wood surface. I want these stripes more prominent along the top of the crate. I'm not sure why that is, but it's how it appears in my photo references, so I'm just gently painting out some values near the base of the wood. You could also use a gradient layer for the same effect. And then I'm just reducing the opacity of these stripes so that they don't take away too much attention from the stencils. To add some extreme age to this crate, I'm going to start quote-unquote sculpting in some splits in the wood using the height map to create the information. I've created a fill layer with only the bump mat set as active, and I've lowered the bump map value, and then chucked a paint mask on top. And just like you would sculpt in a 3D application, I'm going to take my basic round brush and start painting splits into the wood. Because this is using the bump map to display height information, I need to drag it beneath these metal staples so that it doesn't interfere with their height. I've noticed though that this is now getting overwritten by the dirt that we painted in, so I just need to disable the bump map in that material as it's not needed. Then it's just a case of painting in wherever I want these deep scratches or splits. I've also added some dark brown into the albedo, but this is looking a little intense, so I'm going to break the layer linking and reduce the opacity of the albedo. This is quite a long asset to texture due to how much information is inherently in the wood, but we're almost there. I want to get some colour separation into the box joints at the end. This intense brown colour is mostly just a guide colour at this point. I actually want to use this layer to incorporate some of the fibrous cross sections that you see in chopped wood. With the initial joint ends painted, I'm dragging in this oak bark material. It has a strong directional normal with varying height information due to the flaky nature of bark, which I can take advantage of for these joints. I'm increasing the tiling to about 5 times and upping the contrast of the normal map. And then just altering the rotation of the material until I get diagonal fibrous normal information that looks like splintered wood. It's then time to paint in all the other box joint ends until all the joints in the crate are treated this way. I'm also including the ends of the wood planks at the bottom as well. And then you might have noticed I just dragged the order of this box joint discoloration layer down, and that's because I noticed that the faded edges that we did earlier on were being covered up and we want to preserve those. So it's finally time to just polish up the crate and tie up some loose ends. The first error that I've noticed is that the exaggerated wood grain from the cracked pine material has some really harsh transitions in the mask, which is looking pretty bad with the roughness of the wood currently. So I'm just revisiting that paint layer in the mask to blend out some of the really obvious transitions. I also want to improve the roughness of the wood because currently it's way too glossy and smooth all over, with no real breakup in how it responds with the lighting. I'm going to add a fill layer at the top, which conveniently has just shown me there's some more information in the cracked pine material that I want to remove even further. But besides that, I'm going to use this layer to add solely to the roughness map. In the library, we can see there's a few wood grain grunge maps which we can utilize here. To start with, I'm going to boost the roughness so that this fill layer is removing all glossiness. I'll then mask it off and add a fill layer to said mask, where I'll plug in one of the wood grain grunges. In this case, I've taken a liking to the charred wood, and then I'll just play with its intensity and tiling until I get the kind of distinction in the roughness that I'm after. We can finally call the wood crate finished. You might have noticed I've brightened it up a bit too, but there's these cardboard inserts on the inside that we need to focus on now. There's a few different elements that I want using the same group of cardboard materials, so again I'm relying on my object ID map to select them all. I'm not going to spend a massive amount of time on these since they're mostly obscured by the bottles, and thankfully Toolbag 4's library does include a few cardboard materials that we can use straight out of the box. I'm just hiding the other elements so we can really see what's going on here. To be honest, the basic cardboard material is already pretty strong. I'm just going to tweak its hue and value a bit to separate it out from the value of the wood. You can imagine the cardboard is pretty old and battered, so I'm going to add this aluminium foil material on top in order to scavenge its normal information. And then I'm bumping up the tiling so that the wrinkles aren't too overpowering. And then using a grunge map to pick out patches of the wrinkles, just so they don't overpower the nice corrugated effect we've got in the cardboard. As with the wood in the crate itself, I'm adding a fill layer with a pale beige albedo, which I'll then apply to the edges in order to make them look a little faded. And then, as we've done quite a few times on other meshes in the scene, I'm adding a dark and fully rough layer to boost the holes where the cardboard is corrugated. Unfortunately, this occlusion layer, while being the best option to pick up those cavities, does also pick up the occlusion generated from the bottles and the crate bottom, so I'm going to have to add a paint layer on top and remove the AO information from the UV islands that I don't want affected. Again, the canvas view is ideal for this as I can clearly see where the dark AO is creating gradients on the side of the cardboard. Then I'm just using the fill bucket to remove these areas from the mask. With the box done and dusted, it's time to get to work on the glass bottles. I'll start by adding a basic glass material into the folder so that we can get the transmission mask set up. These will start by just looking kinda cloudy and white, but if I quickly turn on the ray tracing in the render menu, you can see that actually they're already looking like glass bottles and we haven't even done much at this point. Ray tracing can be too distracting to work with when turned on though, so I'm gonna stay in raster rendering for now. The glass itself doesn't need much alteration. Most of the surface information for these bottles is gonna come from the dirt and the dust, kind of like with the shelves on the trolley. So I'll begin with the dirt. My photo references show lots of light brown buildup from years of presumably sitting in storage. Concrete materials are again ideal for this due to their high frequency noise and low contrast. In this instance, I'm going to use concrete rough. and lighten the colour up to a sort of beige. I'll begin by adding a dirt layer and playing with all of the parameters until I get a nice concentration around the neck, under the lid, and some light dirt along the surface. Before I continue on customizing this dirt further though, I need to get some placeholder materials in for the labels, as they're currently being affected by the same concrete material, which obviously we don't want. I'm just quickly making a new folder with this stained paper material applied, though I promise this is entirely placeholder and we will revisit these labels once the glass of the bottles is done. And then I'll just tone it down a touch with an albedo only fill layer on top, set to about 70% opacity. Anyway, back to the glass. The dust is looking suitably grainy now, but way too heavy-handed. If I turn ray tracing back on, you can see that it's really dulled the glass almost to the point that it looks frosted, which I want to pull back from. I'm going to first tighten it up with a levels adjustment, and you can see a combination of this with a turbulence layer. The dirt is looking finer and less cloggy than it was initially. And while this is looking better for the shoulder of the bottles, there's far too much on the sides and around the label. So I'm going to add a paint layer underneath the levels adjustment, and then I'm just going to start painting out big chunks where I want the cleaner glass to still shine through. Now the exciting bit, to add the actual labels to the bottles. This will hopefully add a lot of personality and storytelling to the diorama. There's actually two methods I use for applying decals like this, but I'll first go over the fill layer method. I've created a new fill layer on top of the placeholder paper that we popped in before. I've previously created these 4 labels in Photoshop, 2 for the front and 2 for the back. And then I also have metallic map variants of them, where the white dictates the parts that I want to be foiled. Now currently with this method, these are mapping across the 1:1 UV space, and so we need to modify the tiling and positioning until it matches up with the UV shell of the label. This can be a bit finicky and so is actually not great for jobs like this, but I wanted to demo it as it's still useful for placing decals on large surfaces that the shapes don't need to match up, like, for example, graffiti on the side of a waste bin, or an old poster on a wall. Something like that, you know, where the decal doesn't have to match with the shape of the UV island perfectly. So that's all lined up now. I actually had forgotten that I needed to enable my roughness map too, or else my foil won't shine. So with that turned on, you can see now we have a shiny Art Deco label. I'm going to do the same approach for the other label, the second variant for the other bottle. This one is silver and blue for a nice pop in the contrast, but this obviously needs to apply to the other label mesh, so I need to adjust the tiling and UVs here as well, but this is just the same method that I just demonstrated. So I'll now show you the second method of applying graphics like this to meshes. And this is a bit easier for small and fiddly meshes like these bottle top. We're going to be using the brush tool and sticker mode, which I actually haven't shown you yet. And we'll be using these to project the graphics that I've made for the tops directly onto the corresponding mesh. In the layer settings, because they're currently controlling the brush settings, I'm going to set it to albedo only and load up one of these round bottle top designs that I've made earlier. First of all, we need to make sure that this texture isn't trying to fit to the entire UV space. So expand the projection method drop down and switch it from UV to the fit to brush option. This means the graphic will now stay within the constraints of the brush tip. We need to change the projection settings within the tool settings as well. these are different to the projection settings in the material that we just adjusted. The culling is the first thing we need to sort out because currently the green outline in the brush tip is showing me that whatever I apply with this brush is going to bleed onto all of the bottle cap, whereas I want it only on the very top. These culling sliders can be adjusted to control both the angle of the culling and also its fall off. You can see if I increase the value of the backface culling angle, Toolbag will now try to project the material onto the whole mesh, but if I drop the angle of tolerance right down, it's now only affecting upwards facing angles, as my cursor is on the flat top. So the difference in angles between the top and the sides means the brush won't bleed onto the sides of the bottle cap. I also need to change the alignment to sticker, and this is the sticker mode that I mentioned earlier. You can see now the brush tip is keeping the projection localized to the top of the bottle. It no longer is trying to affect the rim as well. So if I click, the graphic will now appear on top. Painting this on while in perspective mode can make it harder to centralize your brush though. So I'm going to switch to top view via the viewport rendering mode. This gets rid of any warping that you get with perspective or orthographic views and means I can properly align my decal. With that technique demoed, I'm going to quickly speed through me applying the basic metal material to the lids. I want the whole of this lid gold. I think it matches well with the label and the Art Deco styling. Gold was a big motif in the Art Deco and Art Nouveau movements, so it fits the era and colour palette of this scene well and will add some nice reflections when we enable the ray tracing. I'm then just repeating the same process to apply the second bottle top design to the other lid. This lid I want to be plastic coated, so I'm adding a basic fill layer with the same colour, set via its hex code, as I used in the albedo of the graphic. Because these bottle tops are attached to bottles that we've aged quite a bit, you'd expect that they'd also display a similar degree of weathering. I'm therefore going to drag in a second metal material, this dented aluminium that we've seen before, to sit at the top of the group. This contributes a little bit of unevenness and some pockmarks to the surface. I'm then pulling in a third metal material which I plan to use to generate some chipped edges where the paint has been scratched away. I'm really customizing the grunge map and scratch map slots in this scratch layer, as I only want very faint and tiny chips just along the edges and the rim of the bottle tops. I don't want any large patches of bare metal showing through, as that will obscure the graphic design and branding that we just applied. And with that, our bottles are done. So finally, the very last element that we need to texture, the fishing net. I'm going to keep this final section light, as the only new feature I really need to show you is how to make use of Toolbag's fabric materials and new cloth rendering options. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the handle, as I textured it using the exact same techniques shown a few times in this tutorial. So I'm going to time-lapse through this part. The netting, however, we are going to be using a couple of new things. First of all, I'm going to apply a basic fabric to this part of the mesh so that we can get the kind of fibres and cloth-like material that we need to work with. As you can see, Toolbag 4 comes with quite an extensive range of fabric materials, so it's really worth digging into these for your projects if you're making something that features cloth in some way. I'm opting for this muslin as it already has a kind of netting-like feel to it, and it's low contrast, which is what we need. Got to make sure to include these seams here as well, and change the fabric colour to a more fitting green. There's still some white left from the masking, so just to make sure I've included everything, I'm going to paint over that seam again. Now, to get the specific shape of netting that I was after, I made a tiling normal map and alpha map in the diamond shape. So in a new fill layer, I'm going to plug both of these in their respective slots. I'm bumping up the tiling, but it is kind of hard to see, so I'm just disabling the cloth layer while I get the actual netting foundations sorted. Before I can plug in the alpha though, I need to add a transparency map to the project maps, else there'll be no slot for me to plug it into. While I'm here, I'm also adding a sheen map, as these are used to control the kind of Fresnel and fuzziness that you see in simulated cloth. So now back in the texture project, I can add in my alpha map, which should make setting up this netting a little easier to see. Once applied, I'm taking a look at the settings for the actual fishing net material here, as I want to switch from this dither, which creates a kind of soft hazy transparency, to cutout, which is a lot more refined. Cutout mode uses only black and white values, no middle greys, which will give me the crisp edges in my alpha. Another thing to bear in mind when working with transparency is that Toolbag 4 automatically culls back faces of meshes, which can be troublesome if working with single-sided cloth or foliage, for example. To solve this, find your mesh in the scene hierarchy and then disable cull back faces in the mesh settings. While I'm tying up loose ends, I'm also going to make sure that I have my sheen enabled. This kind of netting fabric won't have a high sheen value, that's reserved for things like silk, but I do want to tint it closer to the green of the muslin. For the sheen to work properly, we also need to add this sheen roughness to the project. I can do this quickly as I've done with the other project map, and then I just need to enable it in the active maps of the muslin layer. This netting is so small and kind of high frequency detail that it'll be hard to see any real difference. But I do recommend playing around with sheen and sheen roughness if you have any fabric elements in your project. So that's the fishing net quickly set up. We can now enable ray tracing and check out how our scene is looking in its final stages. So far, so good. The glass is looking solid. The bottles underneath are coming through nicely with their shiny bottle tops. At this point, there's still a few polishy bits I want to finish up, and then it's on to presenting our diorama and grabbing some renders for portfolio presentation. While the main focus of this tutorial, that is the texturing, is all done, I want to spend some time now showing you how to light your asset and how to grab renders for your portfolio. I'm back to working in the classic workspace here just because I quite like its simplicity when composing shots. You can also see I've added in a floor, skirting board and plain white walls in order to give the asset a better backdrop and more context. If you didn't want to have to create backdrops like this, you can add a shadow catcher to your scene. Navigate to Scene, Add Object, and then Shadow Catcher to add one. If I turn off my walls, you can see that this has just added a transparent plane to the scene. It's not doing much at the moment as we have no directional lights in the scene yet, so there's no directional shadows, but this is a great way to add grounding to your shots. First things first is to get our skies sorted out, as these will dictate the lighting conditions quite heavily. If I select the default sky object, you can see in the settings that I'm currently using an overcast HDRI. This is quite flat, and I want something a bit sunnier. If I press the presets button, this will open up the library window where I have a huge array of skies to choose from. These are categorized into a bunch of different times of day and lighting conditions. For this scene, I'm going to use something from the midday section. To apply a HDRI to your selected sky, just double click on the thumbnail. And you can see the settings are now populated with whichever sky you just chose. For this scene, I'm going to go with this mountain's waterfall as it seems bright and breezy with a good amount of blue sky. I do also want to set up a nighttime sky though. You can add another sky to the scene via the Create Object menu. This will allow me to grab some eye-catching renders of the glowing aquarium assets. With the second sky selected and enabled, I'm now going to choose a dark HDRI from the night section. It's also worth noting you can hold shift and left click on your mouse to rotate the direction of lighting from the HDRI. For this second sky, I'm going to go with the Canal Park HDRI because it looks to have the least amount of ambient lighting. Switching back to the daytime sky for now though, and I'll begin setting up my scene lighting. With the sky object still selected, I can actually click anywhere on this HDRI preview to create a directional light in the scene. This will automatically place it at the origin, so in order to play around with the position of the light without affecting the camera, I'm going to switch to the setup workspace. This workspace has the viewport split into 4 views: top, front, right, and the main camera, all of which you can change to whatever view would help you the most. As you can see, I'm now able to arrange my lights with the transform gizmo much easier. It's worth highlighting that you can switch the gizmo to world space, which I personally find a little easier to control when working with assets that may be quite rotated. I'm also holding control on my keyboard while rotating in order to use the angle snaps. Light colours can be changed in the light settings, but the directional light that you spawned via the sky will pick up the colour from wherever you clicked on the HDRI, but you can also change this as well. And on any light object, you can change its type, brightness, and whether it casts shadows at any time as well. So I'm going to begin working on the rest of the lighting setup now. I'm first creating a folder because I'm going to tackle the lights inside of the aquarium first. Additional lights can be added to the scene via the Add Object menu. For inside the tank, I'm going to use an Omni light to get some nice pink or purple lighting on the rocks and aquarium assets. You can see its sphere of influence changing as I alter its brightness. Omni lights have fall-offs, whereas directional lights do not. You can also duplicate lights in the scene list. I'm going to add a more neutral one at the front just to get some more bounced lighting within the water. In addition to these very specific lights, I want to add some supplementary lights to the scene to support the HDRI and the lighting from the sky. This is by no means a definitive look into lighting 3D scenes in terms of theory, as that's a whole topic unto itself, but hopefully will give you the tools to begin lighting your scenes in Toolbag 4. Spotlights are the third type of light that Toolbag offers and are worth playing around with, especially for things like rim lighting or stylized lighting. I'm just time-lapsing through this part as for me, placing lights is trial and error until I get something that I feel helps make the assets pop, while also trying to consider lighting theory like 3-point lighting. With that set up, it's now time to see how it looks when we turn on ray tracing. Navigate to the render object as we have done previously, and enable the ray tracing checkbox. It's better than the flat lighting that we had at the start, but definitely needs some iteration. I'm continuing to tweak light colors, brightness values, and positions until I have a result that I'm happy with. So this is the setup for the daytime sky that I'm going with. I've gone with something quite bright and light to contrast with the nighttime shots that I'll also have. I'm happy with how that's looking when I preview the scene with ray tracing, so now I'm going to show you how to set up cameras to take your final renders. Currently, we only have the default main camera in the scene, and that's totally fine to use, but I'm going to add another camera just to demonstrate the process. Cameras can be added to the scene via Scene, Add Object, Camera, or with this camera icon. You can see that the viewport has defaulted to using that new camera 1 as well. Cameras have a bunch of settings associated with them, which allow for detailed customization of your shots. The first thing that I usually do is set up the safe frame, which previews the dimensions of your exported renders. This helps me compose the shots so that nothing is cut off or left feeling awkward. You can adjust the opacity of this frame also. Underneath is the settings for depth of field. This is essential for realistic looking renders and can help strengthen the focal points of your scenes. When enabled, you can press your middle mouse button in the viewport to set the focal target. But you also have use of the sliders to aid in controlling the blur amount and the focal distance. The flare controls the lens flare effects. This is worth playing with if you have a lot of shiny reflective surfaces and intense lighting effects. For this scene though, I want it pretty much non-existent. Distortion allows you to distort the lens with things like barrel and pincushion effects, and to add chromatic aberration as well. So that's a look at the lens specific options, but now we can take a peek at the post effects. The first group of settings is to control the colour. You have a choice of 4 tone mapping presets provided with Toolbag. I usually go with Aces. These settings can still be adjusted further with the sliders underneath. Sharpening your scene is great if you have a lot of high frequency details that you want to bring focus to. But be careful not to over sharpen your image, as this can be harsh for the audience. The same can be said for bloom. You don't want this too high as it will wash out your images. Vignettes can be added with these options, and you can change the colour as well. Lastly is the grain option. I tend to leave this on its default setting, but it can be useful if you're going for a vintage style or something similar. So that's a quick look at the camera settings, but there's one thing that I do want to change still, and that's the dimensions of my render. I want more of a square image ratio because there's a lot of empty space either side of the trolley, And for this, I'll need to be in the render options. In the output section, you can specify the size of image outputs. There's a few presets provided, but I'm going to put in my own dimensions specific to this project. You can see that the safe frame has updated to reflect the new sizing too, so I can reposition my camera angle with ease. It's worth noting that you can also edit the positions and transforms of cameras in the setup workspace with the transform gizmo. One setting that I did forget to mention is the field of view. I'm lowering mine to pull the view in just a touch, but it's worth experimenting with these settings for different types of shots. Once I've rejigged my settings in the camera, it's time to start taking our renders. Toolbag 4 allows for multiple render cameras to be added to the output list. Currently, only the main camera is added, so I'm going to add my new final shot camera instead. I'll also remove the main camera just because we haven't set it up for rendering. The same goes for render passes, which are also a new feature in Toolbag 4. The final composite is the final result of all our settings and textures and lighting, but you can also render out individual render passes for things like geometry and material values, and wireframe views too. I can now bump up the ray tracing settings as well. There's viewport specific settings which only affect the quality of the ray tracing in the viewport and not the renders. But otherwise, I'm just making sure that my bounces and transmission bounces are high enough to get good results, especially with the amount of glass and other transmissive materials in this scene. Finally, I'm setting the output path and file format of my renders, and then bumping up the samples for the output ray tracing. You can also set your denoise strength, which can help smooth out rendering artifacts, and enable transparency if you want to render out only the meshes on a transparent background. Because the samples in the output section are independent of the viewport settings, I can set the viewport ray tracing settings lower so that it's faster to preview the result. If I'm happy with how it looks, all I need to do is click Render Image to begin the process. So that's our scene baked, textured, lit, and rendered out for our portfolios. We've gone over a lot of different content in this video, but I really hope this tutorial has been helpful and enjoyable for you, and has hopefully shone a light on some of Toolbag 4's brilliant new features. As always, I look forward to seeing the different kinds of projects and assets that you'll all create with Toolbag. If you do require a deeper dive into any of the sections covered in this tutorial, remember to check out our Introduction to Toolbag 4 area on our website. Take care and bye for now.